Dall sheep in the Northwest Territories, Mackenzie Mountains, is about the toughest damn hunt that you can do in North America. My Pack Mule Apex client Trent, well, he just went the distance on a 10-day backpack Dall sheep hunt there. No helicopters, no assistance, nothing like that, and ended up killing on day 10. Now, if you've done any kind of hunting, especially mountain hunting, you know that that is a gigantic mental and physical task to be able to keep your head in the game until day 10 and then kill on the evening of day 10. That is very much not nothing. So what I'm gonna do in this video is walk you through exactly what I did with Trent for 6 months to prepare him for this hunt. From training, nutrition, and mental skills development. And then at the end of the video, I'm gonna walk you through exactly what I did to lay out his mountain nutrition plan to keep him fueled for 10 days, to keep his head in the game, and to keep his body going forward so he could be successful on the very last minute of the hunt. Now, before we get into all that, we got to walk through some nomenclature, and I want to let you know a little bit about Trent. Let's cover some training terminology before we talk about training, shall we? Now, I had Trent for 6 months before his Dall sheep hunt. That breaks down into 2 periods of 90 days. Now, those periods of 90 days in our system, we call a training block. Now, training block can last anywhere from 6 to 12 weeks. The main thing is you're looking at the amount of time it's going to take to get the training adaptations that you want. So you pair light training together so that it has enough time to accomplish what you want to accomplish. Now, inside of training blocks, there's something called a training phase. Now, in most systems, and including our system, a training phase lasts about a month. So you're looking anywhere from 3 to 5 weeks. And that depends on the amount of training you can fit into that time based on what you want to accomplish. So for example, Trent is a very busy guy. So at times we had to stretch his training phases to 5 weeks so that we could fit in the amount of training that we needed to fit into that training phase to accomplish what we wanted to accomplish within the totality of the training block. So there was definitely some overlap with training phases, training blocks, all of that kind of stuff. The lines aren't always totally clear, but we need these designations so that we can pair our goals together. That's a really good lead in to talking about Trent a little bit. Trent is a member in our Pack Mule Apex program. It is our concierge service for adventure and mountain hunters. We cover everything. We take care of everything. Individualized training, assessments, individualized nutrition, assessments, mental skills training. I coordinate with the people that support their lives, be it assistants, spouses, their healthcare personnel, everybody that's on their team to make sure that there is a cohesive plan in place and can be executed. And I write up a 90-day plan for each period based on all of those things: training, nutrition, mental skills, all of that. And if guys don't have a team in place, I help them vet people to build it. I also go and see Pack Mule Apex clients in person at least twice per year to do assessments, check-ins, coaching, all of that stuff. It's a 100% individualized program. And the reason it works for a guy like Trent is because he is so busy. He is a high-level commercial salesman. He is traveling all over the country all the time. So I would look ahead at menus to make sure that everything fit his nutrition plan. I would look ahead at gyms to make sure what equipment we had and what we could do, and then tailored his workouts based on what he had access to. Within all of that, we also had a weekly meeting to check in, make sure we were on schedule, and make any adjustments as needed as we continued through the training process. Trent is a relatively experienced hunter. He's mountain hunted before. When he came to me, he was already halfway through his sheep Grand Slam. So he's killed a Rocky, he's killed a desert, he's done a fair amount of hunting in his life, but he had not taken on a challenge of this size at this point. Now, looking at something like that, as a busy guy with a busy travel schedule that also has a family with 3 kids in it that are really active in sports. He needed help managing all of these different pieces so he didn't have to put his mental and physical energy into it. I took care of all that for him so that he could just stay dialed in, not have to think about things, just eat what he needed to eat, train when he needed to train, and work on the aspects of his mental game that he needed to work on. All right, so with that laid out, let's get into block 1 and phase 1 of Trent's training, mental skills, and nutrition. All right, let's start off our training, nutrition, and mental skills talk with a discussion of what we found in his initial assessment. So the first thing, we tested strength. His strength wasn't quite where it needed to be based on his body weight. I want to see a hunter get 5 good reps of barbell front squat with their body weight. He couldn't quite do that, so we knew that strength needed to come up. But we also found that his aerobic capacity needed to improve. So his aerobic threshold, which is the top of your zone 2, is at 140. Now that's not terrible, but based on what he needed to do, during a backpack sheep hunt, I wanted to see that higher. 140 is about MAF, right? So MAF is maximum aerobic function based on the calculation of 180 minus age. That's where most average people are that train a little bit. And that's a fine place to be if you're not going to be walking up and down mountains in the Mackenzie Range in the Northwest Territories chasing sheep for 10 days. So we knew that we needed to push that. And then his mobility was good. And when we looked at nutrition, it was okay, but it needed cleaned up. And it needed structure for us to be able to get where we wanted to be with him. Now, from a mental skills standpoint, Trent is a very mentally strong dude. And that's one of the reasons that he was able to go for 10 days and push himself and then keep his head in the game to kill on the final day. So I liked where he was, and what I wanted to do was play on what I learned about him. So I knew he had a competitive nature, both with himself and with other people, and mostly on himself. So that's what we played on to start his first block and phase of training. So that gave us our block 1 goals, which were pretty straightforward and pretty simple. We wanted to increase his strength, get it up to close to 5 times, doing 5 good reps with his body weight on a barbell front squat. I wanted to see his aerobic threshold go up at least 5 beats per minute. So I wanted to get that from 140 to 145. If we did that while he moved faster on an incline treadmill, I knew that his aerobic capacity and his aerobic power was improving. He was going to need both to create the base for all of the training we need to do over the summer to be ready for the hunt. Another thing that we wanted to do was lose 10 pounds. He was coming in about 185. We wanted to get him down to 175 in those first 90 days, and then maybe put a little bit weight back on to make him a bit more resilient before he went up on the hunt. But we wanted to get the weight off first, so because weight is costly. The more you carry, the more energy it drains from you. As you try to hunt, especially in those strength endurance kind of situations that you get yourself into when you're mountain hunting. And then when it came to mental skills, really what we wanted to look at were 2 things: precision and presence. Precision is really being dialed in on where you're at right now. So from an awareness standpoint. So we use different conversations, rating scales, and questions about the different aspects of his life so he could put things in the right boxes. That way, when he left, he just had to be Trent, the guy that was going on a mountain hunt, and not anybody else. And then presence, we use different visualization techniques and things like that, skills like that, to put himself in that place before he got there. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that when we move into the next section of the video. Okay, let's cover training first. And as I mentioned earlier, Trent is a busy guy. So we had 4 days to work with in the early going of our train up because his travel schedule was nuts. He had things to do with his kids, and just day-to-day work is busy for him. So we had 4 days. So looking at that, The biggest priority for us was to improve his aerobic capacity. That was going to pay the biggest dividends for the rest of his training, and it was going to have the most carryover to what he was going to have to do on his hunt. Now, we didn't jump right into pack training, but we did jump into incline work. So we started on a 10% incline, and he did 3-hour-long sessions per week, maintaining his work in zone 1 and zone 2. As he started to get faster, his heart rate started to stay down. We started working that up. We started working the incline up towards 15% during that first training phase. And that happened relatively quickly. If you get enough volume in, you can start to see aerobic changes relatively fast. You need to keep doing them. You can't just rely on that just being it. But it started to go up pretty fast. Along with that, we did one strength day. Like, I know that strength was a priority for him, but based on what he was doing before he started training with me, he was doing a little bit of strength work, mostly, bodybuilding type stuff, and then also doing some runs with the family dog and stuff like that. So moving into a structured strength day that gave him the right training intensity was still going to help improve his strength. So that first phase, we really focused on pushing his aerobic threshold. Then as we moved into phase 2, we were able to bump it up to 5 training days per week. So what that did for us is allowed us to do a heavy strength day, which was based around, the front squat to really push that up. I use the front squat a lot with mountain hunters because it has more carryover to what we do on the mountain than a deadlift does. So we still continued to build that around the front squat. And then he had another strength day, which was a strength endurance combination day, where we do some single leg strength work. And then after that, we would do what are called high intensity continuous step ups. So he would put his pack on and he would do one step up every 4 to 5 seconds with relatively heavy weight. So we're starting the pack acclimation process while also building strength endurance in his legs. So strength endurance is when your nervous system gets conditioned to send strong contraction signals to your fast twitch muscle fibers. It helps improves the aerobic capacity of your fast twitch muscle fibers because you're going to need them, but it also continues to train that strong signal so you have access to your strength even under fatigue. Along with that, we continued the incline work, but we started to add in some pack work. So he would do an incline hike, he'd do incline pack work, and then we transitioned that from 2 incline pack sessions per week to 1 stair climber hiking session per week. This allowed us to get on a steeper grade without using the pack yet, while we progressed up to a steeper grade while using the pack with relatively light weight. Now, we started with like 15% of his body weight and progressed up to where he was doing most of his pack work, his incline work, with about 20% of his body weight, which is where you want to be to gain efficiency. I know a lot of mountain hunters freak out about being able to carry pack weight, and so they end up going way too heavy with their pack work, and it ends up making them inefficient, because it creates bad habits, it creates bad gait, and it also just breaks your body down. We know that if you do enough volume with 20% and work in some heavier sessions in a controlled manner, you'll get to where you need to be with your pack training. So that's what we did with him. And then in phase 3, we still had 5 days per week. And what we were able to do is 2 strength endurance sessions. So we took the straight strength work, and now we're turning into strength endurance, and we used 2 different tactics to do that. We used eustress training, which is a heart rate based form of training, which allows you to do a couple things. First, you get the opportunity to work on mental skills because it's a stressful environment. You do it usually based on time or the total amount of reps. And so when you see the amount of time that you have to lift relatively heavy weight, it's a little bit anxiety provoking. So what you have to do is just kind of come back into yourself and focus on what you can control, which is essentially your breathing, and then just doing the work when you're supposed to do the work and resting when you're supposed to rest. Just watching your heart rate come back down and then getting back to work again. But since you're using relatively heavy weight for a lot of reps, it's great for strength endurance because it trains that signal from your nervous system to your muscles to keep having hard contractions even as fatigue mounts. And then we progress this high intensity continuous training on another day per week, getting into heavier pack work, getting into longer step up sessions, so that he acclimated to heavier packs, but continued to build his strength endurance. Because, being strong is cool, but if it doesn't transfer over to what you do on the mountain, it doesn't much matter, right? Then we also continued to progress his incline pack work and his stair climber sessions. We started to increase the incline of the pack started incline of the treadmill, while also starting to progressively increase up to 20% body weight on his pack. But we just kept the stair climber hiking without any kind of weight. At this point, we're looking at it's late. It's in May. We're getting into middle of May, and so we don't really need the heavy work on the steep inclines yet. That was something that was coming later this summer. Then we look at his nutrition. Nutrition for a guy that is on the road a lot can be difficult. And so one of the things that I did was I coordinated with his assistant to know where he was going, when he was going to be there, what restaurants he was going to be going to, so I could look ahead to the menus and say, hey, here are your options based on your plan. I knew what he liked from a food choice standpoint, and so I would be able to say, hey, these are going to fit within where he needs to be macronutrient and calorie wise for him to lose weight throughout the entire 3 months. So I had him set at 2,600 calories per day. So what that does is on training days, it would put him into at least a moderate caloric deficit. You have to be in a caloric deficit to lose weight. That's just how science works. Then on non-training days, it would put him around maintenance calories. So overall, he was in a deficit and was able to lose weight. And it worked because we got those 10 pounds off of him in 3 months. He went from 185 down to 175. Now, from a macronutrient standpoint, I had him set at about 170 grams of protein per day, because one of the things that we've been trained to do over the years is eat way too much protein, more than we need. You only need about 1.6 to 1.9 grams per kilogram of body weight every day, and that puts him right in that place. We had him at 290 grams of carbs because that's enough to fuel what he was doing at that point, because we didn't need huge carb intakes because he wasn't doing longer sessions, and his training volume didn't really start to ramp up until the end of that training block. And then we looked at what his fat needed to be, which was about 80 grams per day, which is perfectly fine and allowed him to round out his caloric needs. And then we set some performance guidelines. So if he was going to be doing zone 2 work, I would make sure that he needed to have the appropriate amount of carbs in his meal before he did that, just so he had fuel and it would help him recover. We didn't put any carbs into those workouts. That came later. But during this phase, we wanted him to have carbs before he went. And then evenly spaced protein. To really get the most out of protein signaling from your diet, you got to have peaks and valleys. You can't just have it straight across the day. So we had it evenly spaced throughout the day, broken down. You take that 170 grams and you broke it into evenly spaced meals throughout the day. And then at least 3 to 4 liters of water per day based on his body weight. And then if activity was going to go up, he had more water. Hydration is super important for everything, but it's really important when you're consistently training in the way that he was. Now, from a mental skills standpoint, we started off with just reflection because, like I said, Trent is a mentally strong dude, and that's what allowed him foundationally to be able to go up into the Mackenzie Mountains, hunt for 10 days, and then not kill until his last day. And he had to move spots. He had to do a lot of hiking. He had to do a lot of moving around to get it done. And his base mental strength allowed him to do that. Now, what we looked at from a reflection standpoint is, who am I in these different situations? Who am I when I'm a dad? Who am I at work as a leader? Who am I when I'm a husband? So he could put all these things in very specific compartments so he had precision. And then we would use rating scales to rate where he was in those different things, not necessarily how he was performing, but rating his understanding of where he was in there. And then we just really worked on it from a conversation standpoint. I didn't give him specific skills to work on with that at all, but we did work on visualization. So what I would have him do is, while he was doing some of his aerobic sessions, I would have him visualize himself in the in the Northwest Territories? What does he see? What does he want to feel? What's a success feel like? What happens when things go right? What happens when things go wrong? And just really starting to build those strong mental pictures into his head so he could then build on them throughout his mental skills work throughout the rest of the train up. All right, so once we got through block 1, we had to reassess and see what happened. So it was good, I'll be honest with you. So at the end of the training block, his strength was solid. Now, I didn't necessarily retest his strength. I didn't have to, because I could follow his workouts and look at the weight he was using, and he got to where we needed to be. He could front squat his body weight for 5 solid reps after losing weight, which maintaining strength when you lose weight can be difficult, but if you have the right programming, it can work out really well. His aerobic threshold, which is the top of his zone 2, moved up 5 beats per minute. So we hit that goal. We got from 140 to 145. The next thing we tested was his aerobic threshold. His lactate threshold. That was at 170. So that's a relatively big gap between aerobic threshold and lactate threshold. We want to see that closer to like a 10% gap. It was obviously over that, but that's okay. If we would have had more than 6 months, we would have worried more about pushing that aerobic threshold up more. But really what it allowed me to do was look at where I needed to program intensity for the rest of his conditioning, and mostly looking at going into block 2, what did we need to do with his muscular endurance training, and where was his zone 3? Because your zone 3 is essentially the gap between your top of your aerobic threshold and your lactate threshold. So that space in there is your zone 3. And that's where you have like a 50-50 split between aerobic energy production and anaerobic energy production. And we want to push the aerobic energy production up as high as we can. And so that's why we want to push the aerobic threshold, so more of your overall energy production comes from your aerobic system. But 6 months, honestly, to prepare for a sheep hunt is a small time frame. And so we had to make some decisions based on the time that we had. If we had a year, and we were still farther out, we would continue to really work on pushing that aerobic threshold. But being as where we were, we had to start really working on muscular endurance more. And that's what we got into in block 2. All right, looking at block 2, we really started to have a little bit of a shift in priorities. So muscular endurance became a priority along with maintaining strength endurance, but we also wanted to look at aerobic durability. And so we had to change the structure of the session. So we were still doing 2 strength sessions per week, but they were both focused on strength endurance. We kept the eustress training and we kept the high intensity continuous training. The high intensity continuous training throughout the block got heavier. Now, this is a place where you can really start to acclimate and adapt to having heavier packs on. So started relatively light, but we worked up to peaking at, he had 90 pounds in his pack during his high intensity continuous step ups at its peak, which was a handful of weeks out from his hunt. So it gave him enough time to come down and not beat the crap out of himself before he had to go hunt. So he was acclimated to heavy packs. His strength endurance was in a good place. Now, another thing that we worked in for a month were uphill zone 3 intervals. So he had to push a little bit harder to get into zone 3 and maintain that for different intervals up to a straight interval of 30 minutes. So we did 15-minute intervals, 2 of those, 2 20-minute intervals, which gave him a total of 40, and then 1 continuous 30-minute interval. Now this really starts to target your fast twitch muscle fibers and build muscular endurance in them. And it's a really important crossover because your heart rate's going to get up. You're going to have to push harder on steep inclines, and you're going to need those muscles to perform. Now, we still maintain one of his zone 2 uphill sessions, so we still had an aerobic session in there, which is also muscular endurance training. It's just for your slow twitch muscle fibers. So we did a lot of that work in block 1. In block 2, we maintained it. And then we attacked our aerobic durability goal, which was using your aerobic system across time. So once you accumulate aerobic volume, it becomes necessary to start doing longer sessions, because that's what stresses the system to continue to produce energy over time. It makes sense, right? Because you're just going to be going and doing long hikes. You're going to be moving all day. So you have to start to do longer sessions. So he worked up to doing some 2-hour aerobic sessions. Now, those were on the stair climber. We started with like 75 minutes, went up to 90 minutes, and got up to 2 hours. And we also worked up to doing those loaded with 20% of his body weight on his back. As we did that, as we started to get above the 75-minute mark, that's when we started to introduce carbs into his training session. Now, this is going to serve as fuel during the session, but it's also going to help with recovery because you're not depleting resources. So the more resources that you keep on board, especially from a carbohydrate and fluid standpoint, the better your recovery. So carbohydrates, having them on board, helps with hydration, but it also, you don't burn through all the carbs that you have in your body stored in either your liver or your muscles, so that you can redirect some of those resources to recover, which is super important after long sessions, especially when you're doing them loaded. So we started to introduce carbs into the mix during those long sessions. And we also started to add weight into his stair climber sessions so that we had more of a transfer to steep terrain and doing it under load. Those were some of the big things that we did with his training in block 2. And that progressed throughout the training phases. So, phase 1, we introduced the zone 3 stuff. Then we maintained it with the heavier pack training with the HICT. So we're still getting muscular endurance training out of that. Maintained the incline work, which he was up to the steepest grade on the incline treadmill, carrying 20% of his body weight in his pack, and then also had the eustress training to sink in his strength endurance work. And that's kind of like the perfect storm of allowing you to be able to go and perform the mountains, because you need the aerobic volume, you need the strength endurance, and you need the muscular endurance. I've said for years that hunting, especially mountain hunting, is a strength endurance event. You have to use strength over long periods of time. So being relatively strong, getting to the point where you can, squat your body weight, front squat your body weight for 5 good reps, having the aerobic durability, and then filling in the gaps in between, that's what's going to allow you to go do these things. You hit the things at each side of the pendulum, and you fill in with the stuff in the middle as you start to get those adaptations. And so he had all of those things by the time he left. He was strong relative to his body weight. He had good strength endurance, and he had the muscular endurance that he needed to continue uphill for 10 days with still being able to keep his head on straight. From a nutrition standpoint, we made some changes. So we shifted from weight loss being the main goal to performance being the main goal. And so that means his calories went up. They had to, first, to account for the changes in training. I mean, his body was going to need more fuel because training got more intense while maintaining the same amount of volume or even more. So if he didn't have the calories on board to be able to do that, he wouldn't have recovered, he wouldn't have adapted, he would have lost more weight, and he would have ended up in the shitter. So we walked his calories up by 500 per day. We went up to 3,100 calories per day. 180 grams of protein, 400 grams of carbs per day, and about 90 grams of fat per day. So that it allowed him to put a few more pounds back on, which is where he needed to be to be resilient. But then it also helped him recover from his training. And the same kind of structure that we used last time, I sent him sample meals to be able to use. We looked ahead at restaurant menus, and we had a solid plan to make sure that he could eat on plan the whole time. And then on the days when he had to train, he had a little bit of extra carbs, right? Because of when he had to do long training, he had some extra carbs because he was going to need them. Now, it still would have kept him where he needed to be calorically, because you're going to burn more than you can take in during those sessions. So we had to find that balance to make sure that he wasn't under fueling. If he would have, he wouldn't have recovered, and it would have set his training back. So he would have been a little bit over calories on that day from a plan standpoint, but he needed those calories to be able to perform during the session and to recover after the session. Then from a mental skills standpoint, we worked on a few specific things during the summer. One of those being cognitive diffusion. And cognitive diffusion is a term that comes from acceptance and commitment training. It's basically controlling what you can control while being able to put your emotions in the right place and not letting them control you. So cognitive diffusion means you take what's happening to you and you put it in a box so that you don't embody it, from negative thoughts to negative feelings to even, discomfort, things like that. So for example, the easiest way to do it is to just use an awkward sentence. And it goes a little like this. So let's say that you're starting to feel a burn in your legs. You got a burn in your legs going on, and you don't want it to start taking you over emotionally, making you slow down or making you feel like you need to quit. Instead of saying, my legs are burning, you would say, I've noticed the feeling of burning in my legs. Now, the awkward sentence, it doesn't seem like it would do much for you, but what it does is it creates a degree of separation because you're noticing it. It's not you. It's not happening to you. You're just noticing it. And you'd be surprised if you practice just that, how much you stay in control and negative thoughts, negative feelings, uncomfortable sensations don't take over you. You notice them, but they don't have to change your behavior. And that's really what you take from that. The other thing that we worked on was self-talk. Acceptance self-talk is it goes hand in hand with that. So you accept your situation and then you coach yourself forward. So for example, you might say something like, I'm noticing the burning in my legs, but I can still keep going. And so you're accepting what's happening and then giving yourself the ability to go forward. And the rest was just things kind of like self-cueing and things like that to keep him focused on the task at hand. And so, for example, a self-cueing thing might just be, drive through the rock, one step, next step, whatever it might be to keep you focused on the task at hand so that you can chunk things down and how monumental a task might be doesn't overwhelm you. For example, let's say you have a huge 1,000-foot climb. If you try to take all that on at once and just keep looking up instead of just putting one foot in front of the other, it can overwhelm you. Like I said earlier, Trent is an incredibly mentally strong dude. But having these little skills to just apply in the moment just tops off how mentally resilient he already was. And it helps a ton. So from a mental skill standpoint, that's what we worked on for him throughout the summer, along with continuing the visualization and everything else that we had started during block 1. All right, now as I promised you at the beginning of this video, we're going to cover his nutrition plan for the mountain, which I customized for him. Nutrition is huge in the mountain, and I think a lot of people don't put as much thought into this as they need to. They just eat, they carry food that's too heavy and doesn't give them the fueling needs that they want. They eat way too much fat, they eat way too much protein, they don't eat enough carbs. And you can't make this random if you really want to have the fuel you need to maybe go 10 days. Heck, some of the hunts that at the place where Trent went go for 15 days. And so you have to make sure, yes, you have your weight to calorie ratio in a pretty decent place, but I think what we really need to focus on more is your fuel to weight ratio. So fuel meaning your carbohydrate sources. You want to have a lot of carbs. You should be eating mostly carbs on this trip because that's what's going to keep you recovered. That's what's going to keep you fueled for moving. And that's what's going to keep you feeling good as you go through the mountains. So the base of our program was getting enough carbs in throughout the day. So we shot for 3,000 to 3,500 calories per day. Most of the days he would have been around 3,300 calories. Now, you're still going to be under eating, but you don't really have a choice because you're only going to be able to fit somewhere between 15 to 20 pounds of food into your pack and keep a reasonable pack weight. If you push it up higher and you really try to meet all of your calorie demands when you're out on a hunt like this, you're gonna have 30 pounds of food and your pack's gonna weigh 80 or 90 pounds on the way in, and that's just not gonna work. You're gonna be underfed. That's part of the deal. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important to make carbs the base of what you're doing. So for him, we shot for those 3,000 to 3,500 calories per day. Now, 500 grams of that caloric intake was carbohydrates. We really focused on carbs. About 100 grams of protein, which would be, just enough at baseline to help with, repair and recovery. And then 60 grams of fat or so just to round out his calorie needs and make sure that he was getting enough because fat's calorically dense. So from a planning standpoint, what we did was he had one full meal for breakfast and then a full meal at dinner. So the breakfast, I have these guys, a couple of buddies of mine or more like colleagues, run something called Fuel My Day Foods. They're Craig, the one guy that started as a former special operator, and just understands, moving around in the backcountry, but also the demands of being busy. So they put together these great little meals. They're 500 calories. They're only they weigh like maybe 4 ounces, and they only take like 4 ounces of water to rehydrate. I'm not doing a pitch for them. I'm not getting anything from them for this. I use them and I like them, and so I have my clients use them. So we'd have one of those. And then the outfitter he was hunting with supplied freeze-dried meals at night. And so he had one of those that was going to be around 1,000 calories. So 1,000-calorie meal at night, a 500-calorie meal in the morning, and then in between, we put together different fuel bags. We did 10 for a day, that way he'd have 10 hours worth of eating. And each one was going to be between 200 and 300 calories. And they were all carbohydrates. And so he'd be eating somewhere between 45 and 60 grams of carbs per hour. And the way that we plan this is we take them and we break them into individual servings. So you do 10 fuel bags throughout the day with the right amount of fuel in them. And then you pull one out and you eat it. And you can also do it based on what you're about to do. So like, for example, we did a few different fuel bags. So like his fuel bag A was just steady fueling, just throughout the day, keeping food in, nothing extreme was happening, but he just needed to keep eating. Fuel bag B was for climbing fuel. And so something that was going to digest fast, and then also, give him enough fuel to get up a big climb. And then we had a variety bag, which might push up to 300 grams of carbs. And so that way, he continued to stay fueled. On top of that, and I'll talk about what those fuel bags were in just a second. I'll give you some examples. I like this drink from this company called Scratch. It's called Super High Carb. It's 200 grams of carbohydrates that you just mix up in water. And it's the perfect breakdown of carbs so that you can use them both for fueling and recovery. And so I had him take 8 of those just to be able to top things off. Maybe for a climb, maybe he had a hard time eating throughout the day, whatever it might be. He had that extra carb source with him that he could just drink. I also said, I coached him that on the way in, I wanted him to drink one of those, whether he had eaten recently or not, because I wanted to make sure that on that first climb, he didn't get depleted. Having those extra carbs in his body, that 200 grams of carbs, and sipping on it as he went would keep him from taxing his glycogen stores so that he would be fueled for that hike, but also recovered at the end of it. So we also threw those in. He had 8 of those. But so fuel bag A, it might just be a honey stinger waffle. And then fuel bag, his was a honey stinger waffle and like a pack of Welch's fruit snacks, one of the little packs. And then fuel bag B for climbing fuel, like Honey Stinger Energy Chews are great. And then like a small portion of Skittles. Skittles work really well for this. And then fuel bag C was 2 Nature's Fig bars and a handful of dried tart cherries. Simple. And so you just portion those out, make 10 bags. And then what you do is you take however many you can fit in like the hip pouch of the belt of your pack, and you stuff them in there. And then you keep a big Ziploc bag in your pack with the individual portions inside of them, and then you just pull it forward and replenish as you need them. And then that way it saves you energy, you have stuff where you need it, and it's easy to get to. But that's what it was. It was simple. The biggest mistake that people make is just taking too much fat. It has a lot of calories in it, but it's also heavy, and you don't have access to that fuel as quickly as you need it. So really basing it on carbs, having a good meal at the beginning of the day, a good meal at the end of the day, and then filling in with fueling was something that he needed to do for this hunt, and a lot of hunters should do if they're going on a mountain hunt or they're going to be backpacking and doing all that kind of stuff. So that was the fuel plan that I put together for Trent. I hope you got a lot out of this case study. One of the big take homes that I want you to really have is that, we did that in 6 months, and it was because of Trent's consistency and commitment that he got so far in 6 months. If we'd have had a year, he'd have been in an even better place. But it was really his commitment and his consistency. The guy didn't miss workouts. He locked in on his nutrition, and he did what he needed to do to be ready for this hunt. And that's why he went out and he was so successful. It's why he could push for 10 days and get to where he needed to be. But aerobic development, his strength endurance, his muscular endurance, they all got to the places that it needed to be. And that's the big deal with mountain hunting is you have to have the aerobic base. You have to be relatively strong. You have to turn that into strength endurance and muscular endurance. And you have to progress into pack training in an intelligent way and not just beat the shit out of yourself. And you can't just rely on one aspect of training. All of these things need to blend together in an intelligent way, in a way that fits your schedule and that is individualized for you to get you as far down the path as you want to go and be ready to go the distance on a big hunt like this.